This is the Sony ZV-E10 II, and it's the most affordable new camera that Sony has in their lineup in 2024. The Sony ZV line, while possibly not named in the most beginner-friendly way, has always been positioned to be a camera lineup that offered a more accessible price, and in theory is easier to use. However, I think this camera is exciting because it's more capable than the price tag suggests. So in today's video, I'm going to break down why I think the ZV-E10 II is probably Sony's most underrated camera, and why even if you aren't in their marketed target audience, it could still be a great choice for you. We will cover the image quality, my experience with it for the last 2 months, the main limitations, the physical design decisions. We will discuss comparable cameras. Then at the end, I'll go over who I believe that this camera is for, as well as who could be well positioned to take advantage of what it is capable of. Let's get started. This video is sponsored by MPB. The ZV-E10 II is a great example of higher end technology trickling down to an accessible level. The APS-C sensor in this camera is the same sensor seen in the professional Sony FX30 released in September 2022 and the Sony a6700 released in July 2023. From an image quality standpoint, this camera is the same as the FX30 and the a6700. This is a great thing, especially if you are a more video-focused user. You can shoot the same high-quality 10-bit 422 footage from this camera aimed at more professional users who make commercial work, but in a cheaper, lighter, and more compact camera. It's been a while since I've used an FX30, and getting this level of image quality from this ZV-E10 II was an absolute joy. If you currently own the original ZV-E10 or something slightly older like the Sony a6400, both of which only shoot video in 8-bit, the 10-bit video you will get from this ZV-E10 II is an exponential upgrade. The dynamic range and inclusion of professional settings like S-Log3 and S-Cinetone really give you a richer shooting experience when it comes to color. From a detail standpoint, this sensor takes 5.7K resolution and oversamples that into 4K video, which just means you are getting the sharpest, cleanest footage possible from this 26 megapixel sensor. Even if you don't find yourself using the available professional settings, having 10-bit footage to just make basic exposure and color adjustments in post is still a fairly substantial upgrade. Obviously, there is more to image quality than just what the sensor on the camera can record, but you can definitely rest assured that despite its affordability, this camera does not disappoint in this department. The only notable limitation of the ZV-E10 II from an image usability standpoint is that it does not include 4K 120fps recording. If you don't imagine yourself using slow motion that often, then this isn't a big deal. It does have 4K 60fps recording, which only comes with a very minor 1.1x crop, so this will be adequate as a slow motion option in most cases. I tried to use the ZV-E10 II over the last 2 months for as many different kinds of work as possible. I used it for photos wherever I went, I used it for upcoming short form and long form content for this channel, and I captured some family footage of my son with it to see how well it performed in a casual setting. If I was going to boil down my takeaway from my time with this camera, it is that it is extremely versatile. Let me start with the most obvious use case of this camera: online content creation for social media. For short form content, the addition of Sony's vertical UI is a very useful, simple change that will probably become a standard on all cameras going forward. We have the returning background defocus button, which makes it easy to get a shallow depth of field for anyone who doesn't want to worry about their camera settings. The product showcase feature also returns, so you can hold a product in front of the camera and it will properly focus between you and what you are showing. Sony also added this new Cine Vlog mode that automatically throws the camera's profile into S-Cinetone, bakes in 2.35 wide aspect ratio black bars, and lets you choose from a few color profiles generically named gold, ocean, and forest. This feature feels kind of gimmicky to me, but I'm sure others might find it fun. If you're a creator just starting out, I do think all these features will help you, especially at the beginning. After a while though of regularly using this camera, I do imagine their usefulness might fade slightly because you'll probably just learn how to use the camera the traditional way, or find yourself in a situation where these features aren't applicable to the shooting situation you are in. Now, my main perspective on this camera is coming from its potential use in slightly more professional environments, and the ZV-E10 II doesn't disappoint here. I really appreciate that Sony did not remove a lot of the professional features found in other cameras. For example, in my first week playing around with the camera, I settled on a complete button remap that actually had me enjoying the user experience more than some of the more professional Sony cameras' default button layouts. I think this is because the more professional cameras have all necessary controls mapped in logical positions by default, so I generally don't feel the need to change them that much. Whereas being forced to remap the ZV-E10 II's buttons for a more professional use case put me in the mindset of what is the most optimal and efficient button mapping for the way that I like to shoot. Here's an example of a few of my changes. I mapped the background defocus button to be a focus magnifier so that I can always easily check focus before recording if I'm using manual lenses. I remapped ISO on the rear control dial to be the LUT selection, another pro feature that I appreciate Sony including on the camera because the parts of the dock project I used this camera on, I was shooting an S-Log3 with a -1 stop pull down LUT that I made to make sure I was giving an ample amount of light for darker scenes to get the cleanest possible image for specific setups. I remapped ISO to the main large dial on the back of the camera, mainly due to the fact that I wanted to fast switching between the dual native ISOs on this camera depending on the shooting scenario. Once I got the ZV-E10 II's button layout the way I liked, this camera felt like it could be used for some serious work. It became so effortless to use that it was actually fun. I have never really found Sony's cameras to be an enjoyable experience to use professionally. They've always been excellent tools with great image quality and specs, but lacked novelty that some other manufacturers have built into their design. The goal of a professional camera obviously isn't to have fun, but it's a nice bonus when it is. I think between the ZV-E10 II's super compact form factor and the time invested into optimizing the controls for my exact needs, it actually made me want to use this camera more than most other Sony cameras I've used over the years, which I did not expect. Now you might be wondering, what's the trade-off? Because this camera has an MSRP of $998 USD, which is $800 less than the FX30 and $400 less than the A6700. What are you losing out on? I did experience the two biggest potential deal-breaking limitations of this camera during my testing. The ZV-E10 II does not have in-body image stabilization, and it is possible for this camera to overheat. Let's start with the lack of IBIS. I shot almost exclusively handheld for this dock project while using compact cinema lenses, so every little jitter was felt unless I used the built-in digital stabilization, which I ended up using a decent amount. The digital stabilization is pretty good, but it comes with a fairly high crop of nearly 1.4 times your typical field of view, which is really significant when you factor in that this is an APS-C camera. That being said, working with this limitation was not that difficult within this project. The stabilization crop didn't bother me that much and even helped at times give me the extra reach on my lenses that was useful for certain shots. I definitely am disappointed that the crop with the stabilization is so significant. If there was one thing I wish this camera retained from others in the lineup, it would be IBIS. But you have to trade something to make this camera this small. You can, of course, get around this issue with wide lenses, so it depends on if you are willing to solve the problem that way and what you value in your image, whether this is a deal breaker or not. I only ran into the issue of overheating once, when we shot an interview with my grandmother that was over an hour long. At about the 56-minute mark, the ZV-E10 II overheated. Thankfully, no footage was lost, and because I rigged the camera with this external fan from SmallRig, I just turned it on and we were able to finish the interview without even waiting for the camera to cool off. This was the only time I ran into the camera overheating, and had I just run the external fan for the entire interview, I don't think it would have overheated at all. Your mileage may vary with overheating depending on whether you're working in a particularly warm environment. I can imagine if you're working in the sun for long periods of time, this will inevitably prove to be an issue. If you plan on shooting clips longer than 10 minutes over the course of a shoot day that is anywhere between 4 to 12 hours, I recommend some sort of cooling solution. If, however, you are doing short clips and your entire shoot is under 2 hours, you probably won't run into any major issues with overheating. Now, this camera is definitely not targeted for stills, but that doesn't mean it doesn't take solid photos, especially if you shoot RAW. I liked bringing the ZV-E10 II for the occasional family photo, and because of its form factor, it was never hard to bring it anywhere with me, which I will always argue is the most important factor of any camera. Will you actually bring it with you everywhere, or is it going to stay at home more often, and then you end up just using your smartphone's camera instead? On top of that, if you enjoy manual lenses like I do, adapting small M-mount lenses to this camera makes for a very stealthy everyday carry setup that I think a lot of people would enjoy, despite this camera not having an EVF. The ZV-E10 II comes with the mode select switch for photo, video, and slow and quick that was also on the ZV-E1. And I love this switch. It is one of the best and fastest ways to switch between photo and video mode on any mirrorless camera I've used. On the top of the camera is the ZV line mic capsule, which provides a pretty solid onboard audio setup if you are in a pinch. Here's a test clip. This is what it sounds like on the ZV-E10 II's built-in microphone. I'm holding the camera at about arm's length, and we're actually shooting on the 16 to 50 millimeter kit lens. This is at 16 millimeters with active stabilization on. Let me know what you guys think of how it sounds in the comments down below. The larger grip to accommodate the FZ100 batteries is also a nice touch over the original ZV-E10, as you now can always use the same batteries as the FX3 and FX30, which is awesome. I appreciate that the SD card door is on the left of the camera with the I/O instead of being under the battery door. It makes for much more convenient media swaps, especially if you want to use this camera in a slightly more professional setting with a cage, top handle, and V-mount battery. Here's a quick overview of the setup I settled on when I was shooting the dock project with this camera. For the cage, I used SmallRig's Hawklock cage with a mini NATO and Hawklock top handle. I really like that this cage added some extra grip to the camera, making it feel more substantial without adding too much weight. The bottom of the cage also has a built-in Arca-Swiss plate, which allowed me to use SmallRig's dummy V-mount battery plate, so then I could power the camera with a V-mount without the need for a base plate or rails, keeping the setup small and easy to tear down. Using a single 98 watt-hour battery on this setup allowed me to run the camera for nearly 10 hours, while also giving me an easy way to power the SmallRig fan accessory that mitigated my overheating issues with this camera. This little rig was great to use and actually made the ZV-E10 II fit into a professional workflow. If you ever wanted to work up to more professional camera builds, it's cool that you can get some experience with these workflows in a camera not necessarily intended for work like this. Even with the included cost of a V-mount battery, this build comes out to less than an FX30 and only slightly more than an A6700. There is also the added benefit of being able to just strip the camera down to the body and lens when you want to. I don't expect most people to rig the ZV-E10 II like this, because this camera is still probably best used in more casual settings. However, I appreciate the fact that you can at all while the base camera is also this small. The footprint of this camera is smaller than a typical smartphone. The Sony a6700 is probably going to be the camera that you compare the ZV-E10 to the most, which makes sense because the a6700 has the same sensor, but has a few key hardware differences that make up that $400 price difference. Namely, the a6700 has a built-in EVF, a mechanical shutter, which ensures no wobbly photos, offers 4K 120 FPS, and probably most importantly, it has IBIS. These are all very useful features, but I would argue, especially if you mainly intend to use the ZV-E10 II for video, that the only real loss is IBIS. $400 USD is a significant price difference at this tier of camera. That $400 nearly pays for all the rigging parts I used to make the ZV-E10 II usable for professional video work, or you could put that $400 towards a solid compact zoom lens like the extremely popular Sigma 18-50 f2.8. Where this decision might flip is if your photography needs from a camera like this is 50% or more of your use for a compact camera. Then the a6700 is the clear winner with its EVF, mechanical shutter, and AI autofocus capabilities. I think the most interesting comparable camera is the recently announced Fujifilm X-M5, which I have yet to review, but I will be reviewing in the future. At $799 and a very similar feature set, I am curious to see how that camera stacks up to the ZV-E10 II, but having not used it yet, I can't compare them from experience. If you are torn between the Sony ZV-E10 II because IBIS is super important to you, but the Sony a6700 is slightly too expensive, then you may want to consider picking up a used camera from today's sponsor, MPB. MPB is the largest global platform to buy, sell, and trade used photography and videography gear. Even though I make videos about a lot of brand new cameras, I am a huge advocate for buying used camera gear to save yourself some money and keeping perfectly good cameras or gear from collecting dust or worse, ending up in a landfill. MPB has a lot of great options that are the same price or lower than the ZV-E10 II. For example, the fairly comparable Sony a6600, which has an EVF, mechanical shutter, similar 24 megapixel sensor. It shoots up to 4K 120 FPS, all in a weather-sealed body for less than a ZV-E10 II. If you are more of a photographer, the Sony a7R II, which has a 42.1 megapixel sensor, IBIS, and a solid EVF, is still a very capable stills camera to this day. That's just two of the many choices for cameras available under $1,000 at MPB right now. So if you want more options within your budget similar to that of the ZV-E10 II, but you don't need to buy a brand new camera, then you can shop used with MPB at the first link in the video description. Thank you to MPB for making this video possible. I think the Sony ZV-E10 II will go on to be a gem of a camera in the future. If you are a more technical person who cares a lot about perfectly optimal value, then something like the Sony a6700 will probably fit you better. However, if you are a beginner to video, want to become a content creator, or you just want a better than your smartphone camera for memories and family events, this camera will probably be more than you will need for a long time. And I think that's a good thing, because it can grow with you while being relatively accessible to use from the get-go. If you want to make videos with the intent to become a professional, the ZV-E10 II is an amazing starting point. I wish I had it available to me when I first started out. This camera in my time with it held up for professional work, the image is fantastic, and the actual user experience, if you can get over things like the stabilization crop, the lack of an EVF, the electronic shutter, then I think this camera will serve you very well for a long time. I really do love the form factor. The friction between picking up this camera and actually making something is about as low as it's ever been for a mirrorless camera, and that's great. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching.